I will say, though, it's interesting how Hollywood films really want, especially in the Western context, American context, to have representation, except for when the Americans have to be pure evil. And then they become very white and very male very quick, except for Allison Janney. And then I met Tammy to go see The Creator.
Okay, well, shall we start there then?
Sounds good.
Yes, the creator, new film from Gareth Edwards, British
Hmm.
filmmaker who did recently, he did Rogue One.
Hmm.
Well, he did Rogue One until he was taken off Rogue One, and it was finished by somebody else because do you remember when Rogue One came out? Just to go on a tangent immediately,
Yeah,
when
I
it
do,
was,
and it's one of the few new Star Wars movies I really enjoyed.
I think it's the best of the new Star Wars movies by quite some
Yeah.
margin. But if you remember when the first trailer came out, it was this very dark, ominous tale about, yes, I am a rebel, and
Hmm.
I do all these things. And half of those scenes are not in the finished movie. There are
Right.
different takes of it, which and the tone is much kind of lighter. And I think he was going for something sort of far darker than Disney really had planned for. And so I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I think he was kind of taken off the project in the edit, and there were some reshoots with one of the Gilroys, I think Tony Gilroy, maybe.
Hmm.
So, anyway, so I say he was behind that. Previous to that, he did the 2014 sort of reboot of Godzilla, which has
Right.
kicked off the whole kind of monsterverse, as it's called. And before that, his first movie was this very small, independent, sort of homemade sci-fi sort of thriller called Monsters, which
Oh.
was Scoot McNairy going through sort of Mexico on a road trip, but it's become a kind of locked down, infected zone because there are these giant sort of tripod like aliens wandering around in that area. And apparently he just went down to Mexico with some mates and they just shot the movie. And then he at home himself, he did all the CGI because his background is in sort of CGI before all of that, and he put it all
Interesting.
in, and it's just
Yeah.
really good. It's a really good little movie.
Yeah.
It's
See, I'm
it's easy to find.
surprised that Disney pulled him from Rogue One because Disney
Mm,
makes such good movie choices these days.
absolutely,
Disney's just really on top of it,
they
and
can do no wrong for sure.
no, they really have their finger on the pulse of the American and international film audience.
God bless them. God bless them. But yeah, no. So suffice to say, when this came up and it's an original thing, he was one of the writers on it. I was actually quite sort of looking forward to this. I
Hmm.
appreciate what he's done in the space, if you like. So the setup of this is essentially sort of near future. AI has run amok, and there has been an apocalyptic event sort of 10-15 years earlier where sort of the rise of the machines caused a nuclear blast in LA.
Hmm.
That caused the Americans to backpedal on their embrace of AI technology and robot technology, whereas the other hemisphere, New Asia, as it's called, sort of
Yes.
have really run with it, really integrated AI in. But the Americans, being the Americans, have decided that they are still committed to kind of wiping out AI, and so there is kind of a war going on between the
Yeah.
two hemispheres. And in the middle of that, you got John David Washington as a who is very much sort of has very much quite literal divided loyalties, doesn't he?
Yes, yes, he does. He does. James, I went into this film really wanting to like it. I mean, the whole idea of engaging with the big questions of consciousness and AI and what does it mean to be alive and these kinds of thought-provoking questions, which we probably won't come to an answer to anytime soon. But
Mm.
I was going in hoping it was going to be one of these movies that like days and even weeks out I'd still be thinking about. And I left with completely the opposite
Oh,
response.
interesting.
I ended up not caring for this movie as near as much as I thought, and I was actually having an exchange with another film critic over the last couple of days who
How dare
enjoyed it
you?
that I personally know. Yeah, on Facebook, and we came to the conclusion he really liked it, but we came to the conclusion that this is a marketing problem because I went in thinking any kind of movie that goes in where you're seeing the poster with AI Sims robots on the poster, it has a movie title, The Creator, and AI is the focal marketing concept that they're driving.
Mm.
Then you go in and realize actually this is a 2-hour movie about American foreign policy in Southeast Asia. It's a little disjointed because I'm thinking, well, this is not the movie I signed up for. So already suddenly expectations are lowered. And it's not that I have an issue with exploring bad American foreign policy, particularly in Southeast Asia. It's just that's not the movie I signed up for.
I'm glad you added the bad, because when you were like, oh, it turned out to be a movie about American foreign policy, I was like, yeah, but it doesn't paint it in a very flattering light.
No, no.
There are very strong allusions to particularly the Vietnam War in this, visual tropes. There's a lot of motifs in the movie which recall Apocalypse Now and Platoon, particularly, I think, in how you see, and I think, and those have been used by a number of filmmakers already, most notably James Cameron. Aliens was very much the same thing. It was, a lot of high tech force being used against an indigenous, or well, not quite indigenous, but a perceived more simple civilization that completely overpowers them. So Cameron's used that, and then obviously in Avatar he kind of does the same thing again, really. And so there's a lot of that kind of thing. You see great big highly advanced spaceships and heavily armed space marines pouring off their cruisers and their landers into paddy fields and mountains with Buddhist temples on them, and this kind of and sort of idyllic Thai island beaches and what have you, just completely sort of running amok, but then inevitably becoming unstuck by the locals, who have, as we said, a number of them have sort of fully integrated AI into their world. So there are sort of robots, there are cyborg characters that are kind of half humans, half robots, and all kinds of technological sort of integration.
Yeah, and the idyllic, you and I have lived in Southeast Asia for many
Decades.
many years, and so there was kind of another issue I had with this was the two-dimensional nature of the conflict as it's presented. The Americans are very two-dimensional, monolithic, bad, evil. There's not any kind of nuance of why do they feel so compelled, other than this simulated 9/11 event, that they're just going to wipe out AI wherever it is in the world. And then there's the idyllic New Asia, where, like you said, everything looks like Thailand and Buddhist temples. And there's no nuance that actually, Southeast Asia has a plethora of problems. It's not this idyllic Tibetan enlightened place. There's nuance to be found, and yet this film really engages in this war on terror commentary in a very good, bad, evil. There's just no nuance whatsoever. It's just really, in my eyes.
Are you suggesting that there is nuance to the war on terror?
Yeah. I mean, not that I'm an advocate of a lot of aspects of it, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be critiqued. What I found problematic in this was, we're going to use AI. Like, if we're going to explore otherness, like, how do we offer dignity and compassion to the other, which would have been an interesting take. How we have a history in humankind, not just Americans, of othering people. Like, do they deserve to be treated as humans? And so that's an interesting, we can go back into history. And if we're going to annihilate 6 million Jews in Nazi Germany, we cannot allow them to be human. They have to be subhuman. And the whole issue with the AI robots is there is an inherent subhumanness to them. It's, if I program my toaster to tell jokes or to cry when it gets too hot, it's not alive. It's just mimicry of humanness. But
that's the question, isn't it? That the film is exploring.
But that question is no, but they don't explore it. That's my problem. They never really explore it.
I think they do. I think that it does present AI characters that, yes, on the surface are perceived as subhuman, as you like, but then it presents human characters who have far less compassion and empathy like the Ralph Ineson, general character who's just like, no, drop the bombs, wipe them all out,
Sure.
exterminate them all. Who is far less human, or as far less of an understanding, or expresses traits of humanity than little Alfie. This AI thing, that they keep having to press this dialogue that it's not human.
Right.
They're not real people. They're not
Mhm.
humans.
Right.
And it becomes an increasingly less convincing argument, or rather, John David Washington's character becomes less and less convinced by that argument as the film goes on. I know that it paints in very broad strokes, sure,
Yeah.
because I think that this is the subtext of the movie rather than the text of the movie.
Mhm.
I think first and foremost, what Gareth Edwards is setting out to do is to make a big, visually spectacular sci-fi epic, but just
Mhm.
one that touches on themes like AI, which we've seen in Blade Runner and even 2001 and Blade Runner and the movie AI and what have you. This idea that it's not that they are more human than human can be a thing, and that it's not as clear cut as we would like it to be, as we would feel comfortable to be. I think the most interesting element of that argument is that this movie arrives the same week that the WGA strike is over, in which they win. One of their key points was that we don't, about the use of AI in the creative process and limiting it.
Right.
Because I think there is an inherent fear that is justified by everybody in this industry that it will soon get good enough to be to replace us, kind of thing.
No,
Not
absolutely.
to
Yeah.
use some Nazi
Yeah.
language there at the end.
Right.
But
But it doesn't confer the idea of them being alive. And then coming back to, you mentioned Platoon and some of the other movies that this kind of draws inspiration from. The three movies that I really kept thinking in my mind as I'm watching this is I'm watching Platoon, The
yeah,
Golden Child, and Ex Machina, all
yes,
right here.
yes, they're all
And
there.
each three of those movies was better than this movie. Because, in Platoon, there's this great scene when the American forces go into what looks like a Vietnamese village, like you would see in any classic American Vietnam War film. And of course, they have the bunker hole that's being camouflaged, just like we see in these movies. But what would have happened in Platoon is, yes, there would be atrocities, and comes back to my nuance argument. But then you'd have the Tom Berenger character, but you'd have the William Dafoe character, you'd have the Charlie Sheen character that's wrestling with real moral issues.
Mm.
In this, it's just painted where, okay, there's this monolithic evil Americans coming in, and I guess being the American, people say, oh, you're just defending the Americans, but I just found from a story, it just doesn't make for an interesting story, because that's not how real situations like this occur. It's the conflict within that group that I would have found interesting, rather than just kind of this, we have an idealistic good, we have a malevolent bad, and we're going to throw them at each other with John David Washington, or David John David
Yeah.
John David Washington, with this conflicted role. And you mentioned dialogue earlier. There was no interesting dialogue in this whole film. When you look at Blade Runner, that final scene with Rutger Hauer, that would actually have me at least questioning, is this person alive? I'd say, other than the Alfie scene at the end where she's crying, I'm never really convinced that these AI are alive. To me, it's just mimicry. It's programming. This is how they're programmed. There's no debate on what makes them alive. Like I said, do we confer dignity to a toaster because we program it to cry or to tell jokes? It's these questions
isn't making toast enough to give a toaster dignity?
Well, I'm not going to throw it against the wall, unless it burns my toast. But
is that the toaster burning your toast, or is that you burning your toast with the toaster?
It's probably me burning the toast.
There you go.
The point is, when we anthropomorphize computers and we put our own humanness onto them, these are questions to be asked. At what point is something alive? And in a movie like Ex Machina, really delves into that question. This film skirts it totally. It has no interest in that question. And that, for me, makes it a much less interesting film.
Okay. I mean, I can't dispute anything you're saying. That's all true. I think that his priorities lie. I mean, Ex Machina is about that and pretty much only that. And it's a much smaller movie with a small scale. It's all set in like one bunker basically, or a house, whatever, most of the time, and so it's able to explore those in more details. I think Gareth Edwards is trying to do something not better, but bigger, something more, address a number of different things, or certainly touch on a number of different things. I think his I cannot deny that he has obviously seen all the right movies and read all the right books, but I was quite sort of pleased, relieved, I think is probably the better word, because you see so much derivative science, particularly science fiction, it seems to be these days, where they're just wholesale lifting entire set pieces or entire ideas from other better movies, books, stories, whatever, and just bolting them all together in order to tell something that is far less than the sum of its parts. What I did see and appreciate in the creator is that he's read all those things, he's watched all those things, but he is trying to recontextualize them all into his world, into a new world that he's created. And at the end of the day, all science fiction really, and it goes with other genres as well, but science fiction is probably the easiest one to talk about it with, is all about just building upon existing ideas.
Sure.
It's all a process. It's all just evolution, and there are good ways of doing it and there are other ways of doing it, and it never felt to me like he was just ripping other stuff off here. Right. It felt like he was
no, and I give it credit for that.
Yeah, he was kind of paying homage, paying tribute. He was tipping his cap to all of this stuff, and I think what he created was something that I could enjoy on its own, visually, narratively. I mean, the to refer back to the Golden Child story of there being some young innocent who is the savior of the has been used a billion times in a billion different genres and a billion different movies, and it's a bit hokey. And the minute, this is not a spoiler, the minute that in the first 5 minutes his pregnant wife dies, when he then finds himself on the trail to find a child, you don't have to be a genius to kind of put 2 and 2 together and know exactly where this is going very, very early on. So in some degrees, this is playing very comfortably within certain conventions and certain genres and certain tropes. But I think, if only on a purely visual level, this was one of the most visually interesting science fiction movies I've seen in a long time. I think all of the films that you name checked are definitely in there. I think there is a lot of Star Wars in there as well. It just in the ships and in the way the costumes are designed and that kind of thing. The way technology and sort of old world cultures are integrated feels very Star Wars. Star Wars, certainly the original one, owed a great debt to old samurai movies, old Kurosawa movies. Yeah, and I think an element of that remains, and you can see his love for just sort of Asia and Asian cultures. I mean, as we've already said, they shot in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Nepal, Vietnam, all over Tokyo, and I think it really captures this great sort of exoticism. Sure, it's fairly superficial, but it similarly feels kind of rich and authentic and exotic in a way that suits the narrative. Anyway, I've spoken enough.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that I mean, there are certain aspects I did enjoy that I thought were visually stunning and very creative. I thought the semi-sentient running, exploding bombs that the Americans would send in was quite interesting. And I do appreciate, I'm not the first to note this, it's been noted before, that it's great to see a original sci-fi movie that's not based on original IP somewhere.
Absolutely.
That it is based on original IP. And so, I applaud anybody who swings for the fences in a way that
Edwards,
Gareth
yeah.
Edwards, in the way that Gareth Edwards does. I just felt it was disjointed. Again, I think a lot of it had to do with my expectations, because with a title like The Creator, and an AI-centered film, I was not prepared for basically a war on terror analogy, which is really what this film is. And I'm not sure that it conveyed what it wanted to convey by using AI as the insertment for the other, whatever we want to insert as the other, because the question of that humanness has not been answered. I mean, I think we can look at any other atrocity committed in history where we've tried to subhumanize a group of people in order to enslave them, to genocide, whatever. And we can all agree, that was unique to that situation, but we're all human. The question hasn't been answered yet about the humanness of AI. So to make that assumption and then treat somebody as being evil because they view it as a legitimate threat to humanity itself, I couldn't connect those dots maybe as easily as you could.
Right. I mean, I think that the film has those allegorical elements about war and terror. To say that the film is merely an allegory about the war and terror, I think is diminishing it somewhat. I think it's one of the things that it's interested in exploring, and I think it's using AI just because I think that that's the next perceived sentient being that
yeah, and I understand that
is a threat.
I agree. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it's. What? Let me ask you, what do you think about John David Washington in this?
Well, I don't think he's got the greatest range, to be honest.
Yeah,
I've seen him in a few things now. I still think Black Klansman is probably the best thing I've seen him do.
sure.
When he's playing this kind of sort of slightly out of his depth, slightly bewildered action hero, he just looks a kind of a little bit kind of just sort of lost. I mean, he's fine.
Yeah.
It's not like a sack of potatoes being dragged around in the middle of all of this other stuff. He's fine, but is he a commanding screen presence? No.
I that's where I was interested in what your thoughts were, because that's exactly echoes my thoughts. I thought, I kind of enjoyed him in Black Klansman. He was okay in Tenet, but he's basically the same character. And I thought, what makes Denzel, his dad, just light up every scene that he's in, where this guy has to really try hard to even try to scale that mountain? It made me think of when I went to see Sting with my wife about 4 or 5 years ago here in Hong Kong, and Sting's son opened for him. And Sting's son is good. He's got a great range, everything nice. Soon as Sting comes up, it's like there's a magnetism that just erupts. And you think about Julian Lennon and John Lennon. These very talented children of their parents are on a whole different level. And how do you compare to that? So I'm thinking, as I'm watching John David Washington in this, thinking, God, it's just not Denzel. He's just not. Yeah.
I think the one thing I will say to his credit is that he's not trying to be Denzel.
Agreed.
He is kind of going in a different direction and trying to be a different kind of performer. A different kind of leading man. A softer, more compassionate kind of leading man. Look at the roles that he's taking. He's not just this sort of there is such a kind of sort of hulking stoicism to Denzel Washington.
Yeah, sure.
That he's a kind of man mountain of righteousness, and retribution.
Yeah.
Whereas J.D. Washington is going for something far more sort of sensitive, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it as compelling? I think the jury's out. But I do pity all of these people that do try to follow completely in their father's footsteps, or their parents' footsteps. It's just like, wouldn't you, even if you wanted to get into the same industry, I would want to distance myself as much as possible to avoid as many of those comparisons. I mean, like you're talking about, I wasn't there, but Sting's son opening for Sting, it's like you're doomed to fail.
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
can only assume no one else would book him except his dad. And he's like, yeah, come on, I'll let you play. But then why not let him play with you,
Yeah.
rather than open for you where the comparison can be, is the contrast is even more obvious and glaring.
Understood. Understood. Yeah, I feel the same way.
Okay. I think we're going to have to sort of agree to disagree somewhat with how effective the creator was in what it set out to achieve. But
I will say, though, it's interesting how Hollywood films really want, especially in the Western context, American context, to have representation, except for when the Americans have to be pure evil. And then they become very white and very male very quick, except for Allison Janney.
I was going to say,
I was just thinking, I just saw in the news, like the highest level American military officer now there is African American, and I forget his name. And I just thought, but when they had that general who's commanding all the evil American forces, they're not going for representation here. It's
broad strokes for sure.
I just thought that was kind of comical, because there was, even when the Americans go in, I'm thinking there's a distinct lack of representation here.
Except obviously for JD Washington, who is,
well, yes, he's obviously the character from Avatar
with the heart of gold. But I did like that they made him kind of a cyborg, if you like, in an old school kind of way. He's a double amputee, who has a robot arm and a robot leg, and they don't really discuss it.
No, in fact, I was wondering why they put that in, other than to have him kind of be in this world where he himself is part machine. But even then, prosthetics are prosthetics. They're not. I don't think they're a stand-in for.
Well, again, I think it's a road that is being traveled.
Sure.
I think, the fact that he keeps taking them off and putting them on almost emphasizes the fact that I am not one with these things. It's a bit like sort of if you remember Will Smith's character in I, Robot, not a very good movie, but obviously addresses a lot of good ideas because it's based on the is it Asimov? Yeah, it's Asimov, right?
Yeah.
I, Robot, where there he has a robot arm. It's kind of a reveal. It's not shown to you at first, but he has a robot arm that he cannot take off. And that's kind of like why he hates robots so much, because he got in a blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And there they try and make a thing of it, and it doesn't really work. Here, I was quite interested by the fact that he has these missing limbs, and B, that they don't really make a thing of it. It almost made me think, I wonder if it was even in the script, because I don't think it's addressed at all.
No, it's not.
And I don't think it ever is a hindrance. It's not like, my leg, I'm gonna have to do this bit on one leg or anything like that. So I wonder whether it was kind of like an afterthought, but I think it does add something to his character and sort of his loyalties. And I kind of wish that they had explored that a little bit more. And even if it had been in a way that his fellow officers had saw a perceived otherness in him as a result of it, or something like that.
See, that would have made things a lot more interesting for me, and some kind of good dialogue exploring this. But again, to me, there was a distinct lack of dialogue. Like, there is no moment in this film where I think, oh, wow, that was very enlightening, or that was very thoughtful. That was well written. That's going to have me thinking 2 days from now. Like that, there was nothing in this film that had me thinking 20 minutes after I'd left.
But it was really pretty.
It was pretty. That big Death Star American orbital.
Oh, the Nomad. Yeah.
The Nomad. I mean, yeah. I mean, I didn't hate this film.
No.
Again, we've talked about it before. Expectations. I went in with certain expectations, and I thought it was going this way, and it went that way, and I wasn't prepared for that jump shift.
That's interesting, because I went into it with almost no expectations whatsoever. I was like, I don't know what this is. I mean, I know who's involved, but I don't want to, but I'd seen very little. I think I'd seen the trailer once, and it's like, okay, it's a space thing with robots. But I certainly had no expectations, because, we've been down this road so many times before, where you get a cool trailer for some cool looking sci-fi thing, and then it's all just derivative nonsense. Whereas I did feel, even though I think it's fair to say that Gareth Edwards' priorities and passions lie more in the visuals than in the overarching themes of humanity, I came out pleasantly surprised. And unlike you alluded to earlier, it has stayed with me. But I think it
Okay.
is more. But I think it is more kind of like the imagery than
Right.
the topics of
Yeah.
humanity. But it's a good one. It's a good
Yeah.
topic. I do like that topic of, more being, where what's the difference between or the levels of humanity, and seeing the lack
Yeah.
of humanity in some people and where it can be found elsewhere.
Yeah. So are we going to go ahead and grade this film? How are we doing this now?
We could grade it.
Yeah. So I was going to say, out of how many exploding running bombs?
Yes, which were great. I did have a good chuckle when I saw those.
I love how it was a pleasure to serve you, sir.
Yeah, I wish there had been more little elements like that, but that was a good one. So yes, let's go with that. You go first.
Yeah. Okay. Obviously, I didn't enjoy this film near as much as you did. Having said that, there are visuals I enjoyed. There was moments that I thought were quite interesting. I forgot to even mention where they were able to capture about 30 seconds of brain scan and keep the person alive, and they realize they're dead, and the freaking out. I mean, that's an interesting element. And so I'm going to give this 2.5 exploding, running, semi-sentient bombs out of 5. I don't think it's a movie you have to see. But if you do see it, enjoy the visuals, enjoy the metaphor on a very warped American war on terror, and enjoy it for that.
Right. You've just reminded me of that element, because was it Dungeons and Dragons recently where they had a similar thing where you could cast a spell on a dead person and ask it 3 questions. And then they kind of kept leaving them hanging, asking only 2 questions. And be like, come on, you got to ask me another question or something. Yeah. So yeah, that was kind of funny. I did like this more than you, I think. It's been such a long time since there's been sort of a new original sci-fi movie or anything that I think tried to do something new or go in a new direction on a scale like this. Want to be a big blockbuster with all of these things going, all these moving parts, and still, do something new that wasn't just wholly ripped off from everything else.
Sure.
And certainly on the big screen, apparently he used like old anamorphic lenses on new cameras. So if you noticed, it was a really like wide screen. It was kind of even more wider than normal. I think it was like a sort of 280-1 or something like that. I really appreciate what he was going for. I liked that appreciate that the studio let him do it. Just you go for it, because it sounds like he has had trouble in the past. And I'm almost kind of tempted while it's in the cinema to go see it again, because I think undeniably it will lose something when it goes to a smaller screen.
Yeah.
But up there, writ large on an IMAX screen, it was pretty epic. So I'm going to give it 4. I really kind of liked it, and it has stayed with me. And it just kind of like scratched the itch. Did it push the conversation further forward? Maybe not much, but I think it's almost like a nice cliff notes of this is where we're at with this conversation kind of AI.
I love that we disagree, because too often I think we fall into a rut of liking and disliking the same thing.
Okay,
unless it involves people eating people, then I'm
all in. But I like this one. I'm surprised actually, as such a hardened sci-fi man as you, that
I think that's
you didn't like it more,
because I am a very hardened sci-fi guy, and that's why I went in with very high expectations.
Fair enough.
And anyhow, I think we've run that to its logical conclusion. You ought to be in pictures, what a hit you would be.